This spring, a debate between members of UGBC and Fossil Free ignited the conversation about divestment on campus. Although the threat of climate change and the necessity for action are clear, the solution to this crisis remains contested. We, the members of Fossil Free, will argue that divestment is an effective and constructive political tool and that the change must start with BC. Divestment is a political, not financial tactic. Divestment functions as a social tool to enact political change. The divestment movement changes social values by educating the public on the threat of climate change and building the social power necessary to incentivize politicians to take action against climate change. The mechanism. Congressmen need the support of their districts to gain and retain office. They get these votes by supporting legislation that is favored by their constituents. Right now, the fossil fuel industry owns these politicians who, in turn, get tons of campaign donations. Thus, there is no incentive for congressmen to refuse money from the fossil fuel industry and run on a platform for carbon taxes and increased renewable energy. But, as social awareness grows and the population demanding climate justice increases, politicians will be galvanized to support climate reform policy to retain the support of their constituency. This way, the climate justice movement gains the political power needed for structural change. Like every movement, it started locally and spread. In 2 short years, an international campaign is underway with hundreds of schools, cities, states, religious and nonprofit institutions working to align their investments with their values. The list of commitments continues to grow, with 13 schools already moving forward. Politicians can no longer ignore climate change and the growing climate justice movement. The results are in, and the consequences of inaction are terrifying. The increasing strength of the divestment movement is advancing the social and political priority of climate justice, and the significance of this change depends on how much we care and how loud we get. We would like to thank our colleagues Matthew Alansazana and Alexander Tingle for a fantastic and educational debate, and we hope that this can be part of an ongoing conversation driven by a thirst for justice and a care for the well-being of humanity.
First I'm going to introduce myself. My name is Isaac Akers. I'm a sophomore at BC, and I'm going to be moderating the debate, which likely means you will hear very little of my voice, hopefully. So first I'm going to introduce our 4 wonderful debaters. I'm going to start over here. This is Erin Sutton. Erin Sutton is a sophomore at BC. She's majoring in physics and minoring in mathematics and computer science. She's a member of the Arts and Sciences Honors Program, as well as Sigma Pi Sigma, the Physics Honors Society, and she's been involved with BC Fossil Free since last fall. She's a native of Hopedale, Massachusetts. TJ Buckley is a sophomore from the College of Arts and Sciences, majoring in sociology and minoring in history. He grew up in Barrington, Rhode Island, and has been involved with BC Fossil Free since freshman year. He's also a member of the Massachusetts-based organization Students for a Just and Stable Future. Alex Tingle is a senior in the Carroll School, majoring in finance, operations management, and information systems. Originally from Windsor, Ontario, he's been a member of the Fulton Debating Society since freshman year. Alex is president of Alpha Sigma Nu, the honor society of Jesuit colleges and universities, and chairman of the Student Conduct Board. He's also a member of the CSUM Honors Program, where he chairs the Alumni Relations Committee. And Matt Alansazana is a senior studying economics and philosophy in the College of Arts and Sciences as a member of the Presidential Scholars Program. He currently serves as UGBC's Executive Vice President. He hails from Baltimore, Maryland. And I think next I'm going to introduce the debate order. So first, there will be the first affirmative, which will be 5 minutes, given by TJ. Then a 3-minute cross-examination from Matt Alansazana. And then the first negative goes to Mr. Tingle for 5 minutes, and a cross-examination from Erin, or Ms. Sutton, I should say. The second affirmative will be done by Erin for 5 minutes, and the cross-examination done by Mr. Tingle. Second negative from Matt Alansazana goes for 5 minutes, and cross-examination from Mr. Buckley. There'll be 15 minutes after that for a question and answer, and then we'll have another period of debate, I think, after that, right? The affirmative and negative for 2.5 minutes. All right, I think that's all. Without further ado, we'll go to Mr. Buckley for a 5-minute affirmative. Whenever you're ready.
All right. I'll be honest with you guys. I haven't always been a believer in climate change. I used to be a skeptic. I used to think that, it seemed a little extreme, a little doomsday-ish, that it wouldn't affect me in my lifetime. A couple weeks ago, I went to a labor rights conference in Boston where I met two electricians that told me a story that reminded me of why I first got involved in the climate justice campaign. They told me that last year, after Hurricane Sandy hit, they were called down to New York to help with repairs. There, they stayed in trailers with 30 other electricians and maintenance workers, worked 18-hour days for 28 days straight, and they said it was heartbreaking, seeing all the damage and destruction, and doing all they could to help even though it wasn't enough all the time. When the break ended, I thanked them for the service and I went on my way. But it got me thinking. I thought about my roommate, whose house was destroyed by Sandy on the Jersey Shore, whose grandmother's house was severely damaged by flooding, who had to take a week off from school to go down and help with the repairs and clean up the damages. I thought of the millions of people in the US and abroad who are affected by extreme weather every year. People who don't have the same resources as we do, and the same dedicated workers and volunteers that will help them get them back on their feet. And then I remembered my own first experience with hurricanes. When Hurricane Irene hit just before my senior year of high school, I was out of power for 7 days, and I was angry. Like I said, at this point, I wasn't a real believer in climate change. I wasn't even involved in the recycling and sustainability groups in my high school, never mind being an activist. In those 7 days, I felt like I was cut off from the rest of the world. When the power came back on, everything went right back to the way it was. But it made me start to think. I started looking into damages caused by hurricanes and storms in the past decade. I was reminded of Hurricane Katrina, which in 2005 caused 1,883 deaths and $125 billion in damages. Hurricane Wilma, which the same year killed 23 people and caused $29.3 billion in damages. When all was said and done, Irene became the 6th costliest hurricane in US history. It struck me then that 8 of the top 10 costliest hurricanes in Atlantic history had all been since 2004. Sandy last year makes 9. This made me think. Climate change for the first time began to seem like it might affect me, might affect my generation. I didn't know what to do with that knowledge yet, but I started to think of climate change as a human rights issue, and that maybe I should start doing something about it. Since coming to Boston College and joining the climate justice movement, I've come to know a lot more about global warming and its impacts. I know that 13 of the 14 warmest years on record have occurred in the 21st century. I know now that over the last 3 decades, weather-related loss events have quintupled in North America, doubled in Europe, and quadrupled in Asia. I know that climate change has been identified as responsible for the deaths of more than 400,000 people annually, and for wiping 1.6% off of the global GDP every year, mostly at the expense of poor and developing countries. I know now with 99 to 100% certainty that all of these things are the result of human activity and are a practice of finding, extracting, and burning fossil fuels. Most importantly, however, I know that there is still something we can do about it. We can speak up. Since becoming part of the climate justice movement last year, I've been blown away not only by the breadth of the climate movement, but also by the passion and will of the people involved. February last year saw 40,000 people gather in Washington, D.C. to protest the Keystone XL pipeline. Just over spring break, I saw more than 1,000 students marching through the streets of Washington, D.C. to protest new fossil fuel infrastructure and tell our government that we want it to stop. I've had the privilege of working with student leaders not only from across Massachusetts, but from across the nation to coordinate these actions and others. This is a real and growing movement right now, and the divestment campaign is a huge part of it. Since the start of the divestment movement in 2010, more than 81 institutions, including 9 colleges and universities, have committed to divest funds from the top 200 fossil fuel companies. In this debate, we will prove that not only is it financially feasible and prudent for Boston College to divest its holdings in fossil fuel companies, but that As a leading American and Jesuit university, BC has a chance and a responsibility to stand up for what's right, to be a leader, and to really make a difference.
Good. Now we'd like to hear from Mr. Wansazan for 3 minutes.
You mean cross-examination?
Cross-examination, excuse me.
Okay. All right, getting out. All right, TJ, so I want to thank you very much for this debate, first and foremost. But let's start with a simple question. Yes or no, is poverty immoral?
Yes.
Yes, and as a Jesuit university, we should care about the material well-being of those less fortunate, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yes.
So, what is the cheapest source of energy in the world?
Including social cost.
Just give it to me financially. What costs the most? What is the cheapest source of energy in the world?
The cheapest source of energy
Financial dollar terms.
in financial dollar terms, as of right now, I believe it would be fossil fuels.
Okay, right. And these are fossil fuels that, many people in developing countries, like where my family's from in the Philippines, rely on for their heating, right?
As of now, yes.
Right, and these developing countries don't have access to alternative technologies, right? Because it would be very expensive. So it would drive up their energy costs.
It would be very expensive, yes. as
So
of now.
why are we imposing greater burdens of poverty on the developing world if that's our foremost concern as a Jesuit university?
I would say that we're not imposing greater burdens of poverty on the developing world because
But how can we say that when we know that the costs are going to be felt more acutely by those people more than any other?
well, a study out of MIT recently found that for each degree rise in global temperature, it takes away a certain percentage of, it takes away from the global GDP, mostly from
Right, but
those of developing countries. Another study by the Dara Group
okay.
found that climate change in 2010 was responsible for taking 1.6% away from the global GDP,
Okay.
mostly on the backs, and in the future.
But even
up
then,
to-
GDP is a national indicator, right? We're not talking about those at the bottom of the scale, right? Because we would want them in a fossil-free world to defer to what? Non-fossil fuels, right?
But you're also talking about the same people who are most affected by climate change, by the storms, who can't recover after.
And yet whose preeminent worry is putting food on the table, right?
But they can't do that if they don't have homes.
And they can't do it if they don't have the money to buy alternative fuels.
The point of the divestment campaign is, as every other divestment campaign before it,
Okay.
to encourage the government to enact legislation.
Okay.
Right now, we are not accounting for the social cost of fossil fuels and carbon emissions. It's estimated, the most conservative estimates are between that for every metric ton of carbon, we're not accounting for $22 to $276 of damage and of economic detriment.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Tingle, would you like to speak?
Sure, thank you.
Whenever you're ready.
Students taking action in political, moral, and social causes can really be a great thing. But there's a big difference separating those initiatives that are truly successful in advancing a cause from those that are disruptive, polarizing, and incapable of enacting any real change. We want to show you why divestment's the wrong approach, not only because it would be ineffective in solving for climate change, but because it would lower the return of the endowment and take away from the resources that contribute to the advancement of Boston College. Last year, Dr. Drew Faust, president of Harvard University, issued a statement in direct response to the call for divestment, setting the stage for the issue quite well. According to Dr. Faust, conceiving of the endowment not as an economic resource, but as a tool to inject the university into the political process for social purposes can entail serious risks to the independence of the academic enterprise. The endowment is a resource, not an incentive, the highest return for a given risk tolerance, and then put to the best possible use to further the growth and development of the school. Divestment would neither impact the use of fossil fuels nor harm the profits of fossil fuel companies. First, any shares of stock sold by the university would instantly be purchased by a willing buyer on the open market. In fact, it would probably be an electronic algorithm that would siphon up the shares without anyone even having the chance to notice. In other words, within a few hundredths of a second, the shares would transfer from VC's hands to the hands of neutral investors like hedge funds, large sovereign wealth funds, and other institutional buyers to whom divestment means zero. A 2013 study from Oxford confirms that even if all fossil fuel divestments were divested from university endowments, share prices would not decline by any significant amount, simply because the pool of funds is not large enough to make a difference. The average college endowment only has 2 to 3% of its holdings in fossil fuels. In other words, these companies have so many shares in the market that the percentage owned by universities isn't enough to make a difference. So the fossil fuel companies wouldn't be hurt at all. The school would simply be transferring the ownership of its shares to some other party who cares far less about the issue to begin with. And because divestment deals merely with existing stock being traded in the secondary market, it does nothing to reduce either the supply or demand for fossil fuel products. It's completely unrelated. So regardless of how much is divested, there'd be zero impact on the financial performance of these companies, since fossil fuels would be produced and consumed no differently than before. This, by the way, is exactly why the comparison to South Africa, a previous divestment opportunity, is virtually irrelevant. A study by renowned UCLA economists shows that divestment itself actually had little financial impact. The stock prices of those companies targeted by divestment were not even visibly affected. It wasn't university divestment that brought apartheid down, it was economic sanctions, large-scale boycotts of South African goods, private disinvestment of physical assets held in South Africa, measures that could actually affect the country's economic condition, none of which are happening against fossil fuels. The affirmative wants us to believe that oil companies will somehow be forced to leave 80% of all existing fossil fuel reserves in the ground as stranded assets. They essentially suggest this will happen in one of two ways. That governments will prevent these reserves from being used, or that the public will turn to alternative forms of energy that will overtake fossil fuels. The reality, whether we like it or not, is that neither of these claims are worth anything at all. First of all, we have a mountain of evidence from various economists and geoscientists at all of the world's leading institutions, Oxford, Harvard, Columbia, UC Berkeley, political analysts from the Washington Post, The Guardian, and so forth, all of whom say the same thing, that no serious restrictions on CO2 will be implemented any time in the foreseeable future. At home in the US, politicians from both parties agree that there's no political support for passing carbon taxes, a cap-and-trade system, or any meaningful restrictions on carbon emissions. Democrats couldn't even get a cap-and-trade bill to make it through the Senate when they controlled Congress in 2009. And internationally, the two biggest contributors to greenhouse gases, the US and China, will never reach agreement for international limits on CO2 anyway. Just a couple of weeks ago at the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, China, India, and most of the developing world reasserted its belief that emission reductions should only come from industrialized countries like the US. In other words, no assets are going to be left stranded in the ground anytime soon. And even if the public wanted to take things into its own hands and stop using fossil fuels, it simply would not be possible. Scientists agree that the gradual transition away from fossil fuels will take years and require the continued use of oil and natural gas. Oil is still essential in cars, trucks, and planes with no real large-scale competitor. And natural gas will likely replace coal moving forward, and in the meantime, coal power plants will be fitted with carbon capture and storage to reduce their emissions. In fact, the International Energy Agency predicts that fossil fuel consumption will grow by 25% up to the year 2035, and that 75% of global energy in that year will still be met by fossil fuels. If investors really believed that fossil fuel companies were facing the threat of ever having to abandon their assets, then the markets would have already priced this into their stock and they wouldn't be trading where they are today. As Robert Stavins, director of the Harvard Environmental Economics program, put it, symbolic actions substitute for truly effective actions by allowing us to fool ourselves into thinking we're doing something meaningful about a problem when we are not. Viewing it as a moral crusade will only play into and exacerbate the terrible political polarization that's already polarizing Washington today. And with that, I'm looking to cross-ex.
Okay, well, thank you for that. Nice to meet you again. To start off, I want to ask you what you think the goal of the divestment campaign is, because I never heard that one of our goals was to harm the profits of the fossil fuel industry.
Well, I would assume that the goals of your divestment campaign are eventually to reduce the use of fossil fuels or to increase the use of renewable energies or do something in order to promote the use of different energies other than fossil fuels.
Yes, but if you look at our movement and movements since, there is never one mention of hurting the profit of a fossil fuel industry. We know that they have more money than God. We know that universities only have 2 to 3% of our endowments in fossil fuel companies.
Well, then maybe I'm confused exactly as to what the purpose of how you'd actually be able to enact change would be. If we've acknowledged and we've put forth evidence saying that the profits would not be harmed and more importantly, that the supply and demand for fossil fuels is not going to change. The International Energy, everyone knows that even 20, 30 years from now, fossil fuels are still going to play an
Do you
extremely
know where we will
important
be
role.
20, 30 years from now? Our population, where our food supply is going to go,
Okay.
where our water supply is going to go.
Okay.
That's not.
So
have
what-
you
what
heard
is
of,
the-
Have you heard of Bob Massey?
What is the
He
alternative?
spent 20 years in South Africa, and he worked 25 years doing research in this campaign and in fossil fuel companies. And he said that the protests led by students and the subsequent sale of stock and barter purchases by universities, churches, and municipalities played a decisive role in the end of apartheid. Divestment transformed the debate in U.S. Congress, where a 1986 Republican Party passed a sanction bill over the veto of their own Republican President, Ronald Reagan, and in corporate boardrooms, excuse me. How can you say that divestment is not effective, even if it doesn't hurt profits?
I articulated why in South Africa divestment isn't effective. In the South Africa case, there were a number of other measures. Governments were putting sanctions on
Yes,
South
why?
African goods.
Why? Have you heard of Ned Reagan?
Because they recognized
Ned Reagan was a government New York City financial municipal holder, and when he was pressured by his constituents to divest, he sat in on every board meeting of the companies that they had money in and said, if you don't get out of South Africa, we are divesting. They didn't have to divest because those companies got out.
because
That's
there were
why they
economic sanctions because people weren't buying
Yes,
South
why
African.
were there economic
Because
sanctions?
we're talking about, our argument is that the supply and demand for fossil fuels is not going to change under divestment. All the universities in the world can divest of their stocks in fossil fuels, and what's going to happen? Other people like hedge funds and sovereign wealth funds are going to buy up the stocks. You think a sovereign wealth fund in Abu Dhabi, they're the ones who are going to buy the stock, and you think they care about environmentalism?
Fossil fuel companies
Now,
don't profit from selling stock, they profit from selling fossil fuels. Am I right?
that's correct, but the shareholders, when you talk about the shareholder advocacy, getting in the boardroom and telling them that,
We are
would
not
no longer be-
encouraging shareholder advocacy or engagement in any way.
Isn't that why you were articulating?
No, it's
those
not
would be
shareholder
effective in South
engagement, it's
Africa?
divestment of the university. It says on the 350 and the fossil fuel website, we are not engaging in shareholder advocacy. It's university divestment.
And we're saying that university divestment does nothing because it doesn't actually impact the supply and demand for fossil fuels. Other people are going to buy the stock anyway, and nothing's
I
going
just
to
read you a
happen
quote,
to
the
these things.
stigmatization does affect supply and demand.
That's time.
Hi, everyone. 16 years from today, it will be 2030. I'll be 35 years old, and I can't help but wonder what sort of life my children will have. And I know on that day, 16 years from now, I will still be asking the same question. Why 16? In 16 years, if we don't change, our greenhouse gas budget is blown. Lights out completely. Nearly all of us have heard of the disastrous effects of climate change and that we're headed off of a climate cliff, but how high is this cliff exactly? For all of human civilization up until the Industrial Revolution, the atmosphere has held around 275 parts per million of CO2. This stable level of CO2 in the atmosphere is linked to the stable climate that many scientists believe was a central reason for human civilization to develop and flourish. This period that the scientists call the Holocene has ended. Right now we're in a new transitional geologic era called an Anthropocene. Scientists for the IPCC, along with 167 countries, have agreed that in order to have a shot at a future similar to our past, we must keep the global average temperature from rising 2 degrees Celsius. We've already emitted enough CO2 for that, and we are still pouring more and more into the air every year. Currently, we are at 400 parts per million in the atmosphere. How much more can we emit? To avoid total disaster, we need to get concentration back down to 350 parts per million. That translates to burning only 1/5 of what the fossil fuel companies already have in their proven reserves for the rest of time. They will burn all of their reserves unless we stop them. And in fact, last year fossil fuel companies spent over $500 billion with a T searching for and developing new reserves. In 16 years, if we continue operating as we are today, we're going to burn through any chance of ever getting back to 350. In order to stay within our carbon budget and to have a chance at a livable future, we have to force these companies to abandon close to 80% of their assets, as Mr. Tingle said. So what's the goal of divestment? I want to make the explicit distinction right now. The goal of divestment is not to hurt the fossil fuel industry financially. Fossil fuel companies don't make money by selling stock, as I said. And as I said, they have more money than God. And divesting our money from them cannot and will not hurt their profits. We recognize this. Though we wouldn't mind seeing their profits drop, we're after something different. And as we've already mentioned, divestment has proven effective in the past. South Africa, Darfur, and with big tobacco. Begging these companies to change is useless, so what we aim to do is to remove their social license. And what does that mean? We want to weaken and stigmatize an industry whose existence perpetuates the destruction of the planet. Divestment sends a message that it is wrong to wreck the planet, and it is absolutely criminal to profit from that wreckage. It will put tremendous pressure on our politicians to once and for all enact powerful climate legislation. Is switching our light bulbs and buying reusable water bottles enough? When there is a political structural problem on our hands, we need to revamp the system. These steps haven't been taken already because Washington is literally owned by fossil fuel companies. For every dollar those companies spend on Congress, they get a 5,800% return. And where does BC come into the picture? Our formal ask is for BC to immediately halt all new investments in 200 fossil fuel companies and to completely divest within 5 years. We want BC to divest because we seek to protect our endowment from the risk of a looming carbon bubble by removing it from what financial analysts increasingly understand as risky, bad investments. As a Montserrat student, I know for a fact that I would not be at BC if it were not for the financial aid provided to me by our endowment. Personally, I want to see BC divest from companies who face an 80% drop in assets in the near future. And I also shudder at the thought that the foundation of my future is funded by companies whose very existence is sure to destroy it. We have no time. We're heading in the wrong direction, and many of our leaders are sitting and watching it happen. Because these people are being silent, the youth has been forced to mobilize and find a way out of this. You're going to hear our opponents call us hypocrites because as individuals, we still rely on fossil fuels. You hear them paint divestment as irrational, ineffective, and financially unsound. You hear a minimization of the carbon bubble and a radicalization of our movement. We will combat each of these claims backed up by the work of internationally recognized scientists, historians, and economists. But as you listen, keep in mind, is it really radical to want a stable climate and a livable planet for our children? What are we going to be able to tell them in 16 years? Thank you.
I mean, I have to say, you present a very compelling narrative as to why we're threatened by global warming, climate change, and so on, but I'm trying to understand the impact of divestment. So what happens, say your plan was enacted and BC divested, what happens next?
University of Oxford, which you quoted, they said in stranded assets from the fossil fuel divestment campaign.
I'm asking what happens after BC divests, so what happens next?
What happens next? Well, do you agree that BC is one of the premier American universities?
I'm the one running.
Yeah, I know.
Let's say that they're a premier university.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, what happens when a big name, nationally and internationally recognized, divests and makes a big statement like that?
Nobody cares.
Everyone follows. Of course, everyone follows. Of course, everyone.
So what evidence do you have to suggest that any other university would divest simply because BC does?
Simply because we do?
Yeah. Why would Harvard divest because we do?
I'm not talking about Harvard.
Okay, other leading, let's Georgetown, Gonzaga, Fairfield. Why would any of them divest simply because we do?
Previous research credits divestment by those prominent American universities as heralding a tipping point that paved the way for all other universities in the U.S. and abroad in select
But you do acknowledge,
and this is about South African apartheid. There is a quote right there.
But you do acknowledge that as soon as we sold these, that they would simply be picked up by other buyers on the market.
Yes, that doesn't matter. We already said it doesn't matter how many stocks are sold and what the profit is. What matters is that we don't have that stock.
But we've made
we are making the moral statement that we refuse to own part of the future.
But we're not doing anything to change the supply and demand for fossil fuels because we're still driving environmentally unfriendly vehicles around BC.
Okay, I ask you why we are. Why aren't we? Because, like I said, it's a structural issue. It's not like
the structural issue is that alternative energy is still expensive, and that oil and gas.
Why is it expensive? It is artificially expensive. Do you take, in fact, like, we have all the technology, it is there.
So you're saying solar is not actually expensive. Solar technology is not actually expensive, it's just artificially expensive.
Yes.
And it's a big farce. The oil and gas is not cheap.
What companies don't have to pay taxes? The fossil fuel companies.
Let's talk a little bit about stranded assets for a minute. So you suggest that, we're on this doom and that 80% of their assets are going to remain underground. What evidence do you have to suggest, because I put forward evidence saying that there's no political support for that. No politician's going to enact it. China's saying, no, we're not ever going to impose restrictions because the U.S. is the only one
Okay, I have an
that's
answer for that. So you say there's no support. Conservative people usually don't support things like this, right? Well, have you heard of Mr. Lair, Eli Lair from the Heartland Institute, like a conservative smear campaign?
Okay.
He left that campaign after he realized how corrupt the industry was, and then he started the R Street Foundation.
Well, that sounds like
The R
that's
Street
really
Institute
something.
is a group of conservatives who are supporting the carbon tax.
You're talking about one
You
group.
just said there was no support. I gave you conservative support.
Are you aware that there was a Pew Research study done earlier this year, and out of 20 issues polled, this ranked second to last in the American people, climate change? No.
Why do you think that is? How much money has gone into the suppression of this information in the past?
Thank you.
Though I stand in negation to the resolution, I have no doubt that my colleagues in support of divestment have good intentions, ideals of service to others that form the foundation of this university. And yet, we all know that good intentions, without the grounding of common sense, empirical evidence, and discerning the context of the situation at hand, can only go so far. Immediate and drastic divestment, as articulated by the affirmative, would fail to accomplish its purported purposes or uphold the primary purpose of Boston College, to provide its students with resources and the education necessary to grow into the leaders of the future. Divestment harms the ability of the university to educate its students by undermining its financial resources and holds students' well-being hostage to spurious moral claims. To affirm the resolution negates opportunity, not only for us but also for others. Our university requires funds in order to function. The endowment makes it possible for clubs to go on retreats and put on events, for departments to hire the best faculty, and for students to receive financial aid. In some way, shape, or form, we all benefit from the holistic education funded at Boston College. As Eagles, we want to see a growing and empowered BC, which is why investment decisions have included energy companies to this point. A 2013 Sonecon study by Robert Shapiro, a former U.S. Department of Commerce official, concludes that oil and natural gas holdings in college endowments have achieved far higher rates of return over 10 years than all other asset classes. How high? Those returns were a whopping 326% higher than the average annual 10-year 2.7% returns on all U.S. stocks and 105% greater than all average returns on college and university endowment assets. Over the past decade, oil and natural gas stocks also outperformed the S&P 500 by 28%. For BC not to invest in these companies would hobble its funding abilities, especially within the timeframe proposed by the affirmative. If anything, the increasing usage of natural gas as a transportation fuel, heating source, and cleaner alternative, as stated both by the EPA and the EIA, would mean that it would only increase demand for these companies' products, thereby increasing the attractiveness of their holdings. Our peer institutions and even some conservation heavyweights agree with this analysis and even go so far as to say that similar divestment schemes would harm endowment rates of return. The affirmative neglects to mention that divestment is not just a process of simply calling a broker and saying sell. Rather, we do know that the overwhelming majority of our endowment is in commingled funds run by managers, whose purpose is to get the best returns for the community. To divest would mean moving huge proportions of the endowment to managers, with new restrictions and unrealistic expectations. For example, in 2013, Bowdoin College concluded that 25% of its endowment would have to be turned over, and assuming that a manager could be found, the fossil-free endowment rate of return would be 5% lower. These are not small numbers. Even 5% of their endowment is $100 million. In June 2013, an analysis published by University Business stated that divestment leaves the investor with a more volatile portfolio in the end due to inferior risk-adjusted returns. Harvard could see the writing on the wall. President Drew Faust stated in October 2013 that logic and experience indicate that barring investment in this major sector of the global economy would come at a substantial economic cost. And if these individual analyses weren't compelling enough, a Kritzman and Alder study published in the Chronicle of Higher Ed in 2013 showed that in 10,000 iterations, divestments imply an 8% lower rate of return. They also mentioned that these studies demonstrating the so-called effectiveness of divestment failed to include hefty transaction costs, a claim backed up by Wellesley College, Cambridge Associates, and others. Herein lies the glaring fact of the matter. If divestment, as contended by the affirmative, is such a good idea, then why have so few institutions done it? And for that matter, why have so few conservation and environmental groups done it? Conservation International, National Wildlife Federation, World Wildlife Fund, the list goes on and on. They all hold fossil fuel investments in the same manner that BC does. Commingled investments that would be costly to move and fundamentally harmful to their funding initiatives. What we can really take away from these groups is that harming endowment returns can reduce Boston College's ability to address climate change in other ways, like implementing efficiency and green measures to reduce fossil fuel use, funding research in alternative technologies, or sending their students on trips to see areas affected by climate change. There is no financial or operational benefit to divestment, no sense in dropping all fossil fuels right now, no reason to incur huge transaction costs, and no incentive for us to shoot ourselves in the foot by not being able to invest in the highest performing hedge and pooled funds. What then is the affirmative left with? This evidence fails to mention the immense financial downsides to divestment. Their understanding of the situation forgets that the nature of our commingled investments and common sense shared by reputable sustainability gurus shows that divestment is an extreme measure that could undermine the very purpose of these institutions. Endowments are intended to generate high rates of return, not to support political causes, and rightly so. The affirmative plan threatens the educational and or livelihood of every single individual in this room. Divestment does not constitute a consistent moral position on fossil fuel use. BC and even my esteemed colleagues will continue to use fossil fuels to heat their buildings and drive their cars. And in a larger moral sense, the ideal affirmative outcome would drive up energy prices, harming those most vulnerable in our society. We cannot afford a strategy that hinders the educational mission of our school, reduces resources for other students, and limits opportunities for advocates of the future and today. Thank you.
Okay. You mentioned a Sonnequin study.
That's right.
That supposedly found that fossil fuel investments have higher returns than any other investment. I just want to ask off the bat, do you know who funded the study?
I mean, yes, it was an Institute for Petroleum Studies. Now, let me conclude, though, however, that Robert Shapiro. Robert Shapiro isn't the only one saying this. Robert Shapiro was an independent analysis. We can look, though, to the buyer ratings for all the different fossil fuel companies in the world. They all have buy ratings. Why? Because they're going to earn returns, higher returns. Natural gas use is going to increase by huge fundamentals.
So what I got out of that is Sonnequin study is founded by American Petroleum Institute.
That's
yes,
right.
Certain others.
And I think anyone looking at the numbers would come to the same conclusion as Robert Shapiro.
Okay, well, I can point to a few studies. Financial analysis conducted by MSCI, the Aperio Group, Impacts Asset Management, have found, mirroring the findings of S&P Capital IQ that calculated total returns of S&P 500 index with and without the 200 publicly traded fossil fuel companies.
Okay, so what's your
Over
question?
10 years, a $1 billion investment that excluded these companies would have grown to $2.26 billion, a full $119 million more than the investment that included fossil fuel companies.
So
that extra $119 million, I might add, could have paid for the entire tuition of Boston College's freshman class.
Okay, right. But the problem with your MSCI study is that these studies compare against the current, they don't actually compare. Let me show you about that MSCI study. They have 4 different initiatives. None of them compare to the current state of the endowment. They're taking 4 bad options, and divestment is the least bad of the bad.
So like when we compare it to like the MSCI study, there's problems with both studies, but I'd like to move on a little bit. You also mentioned
I mean, once you ask a question,
a negligible risk penalty. What did you say the penalties from transferring the transfer costs? Moving money
not only
around.
am I talking about negligible risk, I'm talking about transaction costs. We all deal with transaction costs. All right.
That's what I'm
so
saying.
when I sell my stock,
I'm going to transaction costs were.
They're huge. I mean, like for example, let's say that
added that.
Okay. Ask your question.
Tracking error. There's a theoretical return penalty of 0.0034%, which is less than half of a basis point. So transfer costs are largely negligible.
Okay, so are we?
A lot of evidence.
Are we reading evidence cards, or are we asking questions?
I asked you, and then I responded with some evidence of my own.
I mean, it's not a transfer cost anyway. We're talking here about transaction costs. We're talking about buyer fees. We're talking about stockbroker ratings. These are huge things that impact the profitability of the endowment of all different types of alternatives to what we're currently dealing with.
Before we finish,
fundamentally, it's less profitable.
You also mentioned that this would hurt the ability of BC to invest in alternative energy. Are you aware of the sustainability revolving loan fund at Boston University?
Well, I mean, no, I'm not aware, but I guess how does that? Okay,
well,
never mind. I mean, time's up, right? Yeah, so I'm not aware.
Okay, well, 57% return.
15 minutes or so to answer some audience questions. If you have a question, let's start right here in the front. Can you just say your name and then ask your question?
Hi, my name is Eric Roy. I'm a sophomore. So I have a comment that I would like to address a question to Mr. Tingle and Mr. Lansazana. I completely understand where the divestment group is coming from in the stance that they want to make a social impact. I am involved with Students for Sexual Health on campus. It's a very controversial, very clandestine student group. Up until 2013, we had really gotten no press, nowhere off the ground, and then all of a sudden we made a huge fuss in the social media, and we ended up getting on 4 continents. We got on CNN, we got on BBC News. We made a statement. We made a social statement, and as of now, the university has complied to do sexual health programming on campus for freshmen. So I have a problem with the fact that social statements do not lead to change. And then my question is, do you know who Margaret Marshall is? Okay, Aaron Sutton. Aaron Sutton.
Oh yes.
Yeah. You said something about Eli Lair. Could you talk more about him?
Yeah, so the Heartland Institute was an institute that basically is funded by all these fossil fuel companies to put up billboards that compare people who oppose fossil fuel companies to Osama bin Laden and things like that. And this guy who was in the Heartland Institute clearly would be against divestment and clearly against anything against fossil fuel companies, green initiatives. He left, and then he founded the R Street Institute, a group of conservatives who support a carbon tax.
Okay.
So that's just showing there is support.
And you have no idea who this person is. Eli Laird doesn't really ring a bell. Margaret Marshall doesn't ring a bell either, but she was the person who legalized same-sex marriage in Massachusetts, and ever since she did that, 17 countries around the world and 17 states have adopted the same policies for same-sex marriage and made a huge splash.
True, but you can't attribute all the countries and other states that have enacted same-sex marriage a direct result of Massachusetts enacting same-sex marriage. Those were enacted because those were popular things in those countries, and politicians voted on those issues or courts ruled on them, given the fact that their populations were in support of that. This is not a popular position. People want cheap energy. People need to be able to drive their cars.
People need to be able to breathe their air.
I would also argue, though, that, obviously this is going to make a huge media splash, and that media splash gets the attention around the world. And even if you're going to discredit the fact that other nations have different political interests, it's still in the United States, we kind of tend to take that seriously.
But isn't it true that, and I could be wrong here, but the group for sexual health you're talking about...
Let's try to have the audience be asking questions at this point, if you don't mind.
I mean Q&A.
Okay. All I want to say is please finish your thought.
Sure.
Okay, sure. I would just point to that. Am I correct in saying that a lot of the controversy at the time that led it to be on all those media outlets was the fact that condoms were being distributed, correct? Okay, and that was something tangible that was being done. That's equivalent in the world of fossil fuels of people taking real tangible steps in their own lives that reduced the demand for fossil fuels by stopping to use stop using water bottles, driving more fuel efficient cars that actually alters the supply and demand. Divestment does absolutely nothing and isn't changing anything in the world of fossil fuels or helping save the environment.
Another question?
Yeah, so mine's directed at Matt. In your cross-examination, you were talking about how fossil fuels are the cheapest source of energy, and so for developing nations who are poor and can't afford sustainable energy, we need to give them we need to let them burn fossil fuels. Well, the problem with that is that in the long term, that ends up damaging them. So being that we're in a developed country that has the money and the resources to be able to develop sustainable energy, is it not our responsibility to start here and make the political change necessary so that there is support for developing sustainable energy, so that there is the hope that in the near future there will be more sustainable energy infrastructure implemented, and maybe it will even be cheaper and it can start being implemented in the developing world?
Yeah, I have no doubt that we are going to be able to find one day an alternative energy far in the future that will help. But who are the main funders of alternative energy resources? ExxonMobil, BP. These are the companies that are targeted by the divestment strategy. Now, let's keep in mind that I'm from the Philippines, right? How are we going to get these countries up to where we want to be? Poverty is something they feel every day. And the only way that we can get them out of poverty is if we can help their material well-being so that they can get jobs, so that their manufacturers and producers can have lower cost of production. This is a real issue. So what are we going to do? Impose a world in which there are no fossil fuels via the West, which is impractical politically? No, we're not going to do that, because are developing countries all of a sudden going to have access to these alternative technologies which are already expensive? No. So like if that's the case, then how are we going to say that this is what is the social justice concern at hand when we are imposing things which they feel every day, which my families feel every day in the Philippines?
I understand that, but from what I understand about divestment, it's not to hurt, from what I've heard, it's not to hurt the fossil fuel companies, but to enact a certain change in the priorities of how the money is being spent, how restrictions are being made at a political level, and how support is being made to change the focus of fossil fuel companies, or at least enhance sustainable energy. So if that doesn't happen, and like you say, you don't believe that this energy, sustainable energy, will be accessible in the near future, then well, what hope is there, according to the facts of climate change?
I mean, the hope is there is that as shareholder owners, right, we want to be able to exercise our voice in order to get more investments to the R&D side. Other different types of sustainability groups have advocated for a long time already that we need to hold these shares in order to exercise this right as shareholders to move the priorities that way. That's how the fundamental mechanism works. Now, if we're going to say that we want to support these poorer nations, yeah, we should make sure that we don't divest from the 200 biggest, as what our colleagues contend, but instead that we support those companies that are doing both and. Now, because, like for example, wind, solar, when there's no wind and when it's cloudy outside, where does the power energy go? It goes to natural gas, which is a transition fuel. In the affirmative world, we would divest from these companies that offer this transition. This is both too sudden, this is both impractical, and it imposes the poverty types of restrictions and types of burdens that I've mentioned before. So, I empathize with the needs of the people in the developing world. But if this is something which the cost far exceeds the strategy for positive benefits.
We have a few questions lined up, so we're going to try to move along, have everybody be able to ask. We have a question here? Yeah, I have a question for the BC Fossil Fuel team. So recently, Peter Bozer, who's the CEO of Shell, who's speaking appearance at the BC CEO Club, your organization protested earlier this year, they basically said that it would be foolish for these big, scary natural gas and fossil fuel companies to not acknowledge that renewable energy is going to play a role in the future. And in fact, these companies have made huge, massive investments in renewable energy. Shell in 2012 invested, I think, like $2 billion in renewable energy and strategies to limit carbon emissions. And so I'm just wondering how you respond to these facts and what Peter Bozer has said.
I think that's taking that, you have to take it in context. I mean, yeah, Exxon invested in green energy, 0.016% of their profits in green energy. And BP tried. In 2008, they started Beyond Petroleum. They opened up this institute in the UK, and they tried, there are pictures of flowers in their advertisements. They tried. In 2009, it wasn't profitable enough, and they ditched it. How can you say, when they spend hundreds of millions of dollars on smear campaigns, how can you say that they're, like, really doing big things in green energy? When I said they're investing, $500 billion in shale, shale oil, like tar sands, things that are even dirtier than what we're using. Like, it's dirtier than natural gas, it's dirtier than petroleum. How can you say that they're, in supporting natural gas, it's disrupting the money that should go to other initiatives, when we're building that infrastructure that we really can't reasonably use and keep going.
I guess the follow-up question though would be, if you think that BC's, whatever, let's say BC has like $100 million in fossil fuel companies, if you think that's going to be socially significant in changing the global dialogue on climate change, then how is the $2 billion that Shell's investing in renewable energy similarly not effective in changing the global conversation on climate change?
To jump in on that, again, the goal of the divestment campaign is not to hurt these companies financially, not have any direct financial impact. They've already told you guys that it won't. The Oxford study says, yes, likely it won't directly harm them. But it also says that the outcome of the stigmatization process, which the fossil fuel divestment campaign has now triggered, poses the most far-reaching threat to fossil fuel companies and the vast energy value chain. Any direct impacts pale in comparison. So that's really the goal of the divestment campaign, is to start that stigmatization process that led to regulation and taxes against the tobacco industry that classified them as a sin stock that companies now screen against. As far as the money, I mean, again, our best scientists say we can't afford to burn the amount they already have, and they're investing billions more in finding more fossil fuels than in renewable energy. We need to find other ways and encourage investment in renewable energy in other ways.
And also, with the housing bubble in 2008, BC's endowment lost $300 million. The carbon bubble is so much larger than that. It has a $20 trillion value. How much do you think our endowment is going to lose that? And there are studies that say...
20% of our endowment is fossil fuel companies, then probably not that much.
Yeah, but aren't the fossil fuel companies, don't they own everything?
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying?
I mean, they literally own Washington, by your own words. So.
Yes.
Well, yeah. I mean, that's true. Lord Nicholas Stern from the London School of Economics said that climate change is a result of the greatest market failure the world has ever seen. Fossil fuels are everywhere. They're in everything. A $20 trillion bubble, that's 4 times the dot-com bubble. That's almost 3 times the housing bubble. That will affect the global economy in a way that we've never seen before.
There is no bubble. There are no restrictions coming. It's not popular internationally. There's no political support.
Internationally, what about the EU?
Let's just move on. One more question. The argument is that no matter what happens, the bubble's going to burst, right? And the 2 to 3% of the companies that are of the endowment that is in fossil fuel companies isn't going to be the only thing affected. Everything is going to be affected. Isn't this bubble that you're talking about going to burst either way? What is the overall plan? Are we going to slowly take out the bubble?
The point is that it will burst unless we take action now. Unless, basically...
And divesting from BC's endowment is going to do that.
It'll help. It'll help us invest in alternative energy, get to a place. The technology already exists where we can get all of our energy needs from alternatives. The barriers are political and economic.
25.
There's no evidence that that's going to pass. There's no support in Washington for it because the people...
Are you kidding?
This is
a
a Massachusetts
law
state
that
legislation.
is going to be passed. There's a campaign with the Patrick.
Some senators just came out and said they would support it.
Right, because you know, like from our
And that was
healthcare
the
laws,
entire
that
state's pension
Massachusetts
law.
examples are a good example.
Go back to the question and move on. We have a lot of people waiting.
The original question. First of all, I would contest that apartheid wasn't successful. Yeah, I'm getting to it. Yeah, you said what evidence from other movements, right? The same Oxford study we've been citing has analyzed all of the documents we have on past divestment campaigns, and it found that every single campaign from Darfur to apartheid to big tobacco has resulted in legislation, has resulted in some type of government response, and response from the people that has affected the industries. It led to industries pulling out of apartheid South Africa. It led to litigation and taxes against the tobacco industry that cost billions. This is a proven method.
Thank you. We have a question up at the top here.
So the divestment campaign is trying to enact social change, and the group against divestment has been talking about a lot how there's really no support for any of the divestment from oil companies or any legislation against them. But it seems like to me, at least personally, that going down the path we're going on, the climate is going to continue changing, and there's going to be a point where we cannot go back. So you don't see their divestment campaign as a way to successfully enact social change. Then I ask, how could we enact social change? Because I feel like that's a necessity the way things go.
Yeah, so I mean, you know, it's not within the parameters of the resolution, but I'll entertain it. So like, how do we do it? We, as a university, our main investments are our students. We will be leaders of companies, hedge fund managers, but hopefully we'll all be making a difference in our own special way. Now, what is the way that most stocks are held? I mean, they're held and they're influenced in some part by individual action. How do we get, you know, what would be a more effective way to institute change on this matter? By getting advocates to care about climate change as an issue first and foremost, right? So we need to have the opportunities here at Boston College to learn about that type of issue and for that issue to be owned in our hearts. Now, in the world of the affirmative, we know that that endowment would suffer. Now, if the endowment is to suffer, we know that there will be less programs. And if there are less programs, how are we going to get this holistic education that we so value here at Boston College?
Can I follow up on that?
Yeah, sure.
You guys are also talking about a lot how the endowment is only 2 or 3% in fossil fuel companies, so how would we be suffering if that's not going to really like make a change in how the endowment is
So
operated?
we think that we can try to find that the gross amount held is in 2 to 3%. But that's not how the endowment works. We can't just say, like, take away these 2 to 3%. The endowment's held in commingled hedge funds, which are involved in many other different sectors. So as I mentioned before, why Bowden didn't do it, it's because they had to turn over a quarter of their endowment just to conform to a fossil-free type of schema. So like this would mean that we have to find money managers who would, one, be willing to take it, and two, match up to these newfound and very strict criteria, in which they did 10,000 iterations of which, you know, there's 5 to 8% less of a return under that criteria. So it's the nature of the endowment, and it's the nature of the intervention that the affirmative is proposing that we are opposed to. We are not opposed to the narrative that my colleagues so eloquently put forward. We're opposed to the intervention in and of itself. And that's the parameters of debate, and that's the parameters under which I hope the audience will make its decision. That divestment as a strategy is very flawed.
All right, so first thing, that does make about 15 minutes of questioning, but it is only 10 after 8, so unless you guys are opposed, there are many people who would like to ask a few more questions. I hope you guys don't mind sticking around a few extra minutes. Is that all right?
As you'd like, moderator.
All right, who would like to ask a question? Let's have up here in the front.
Okay, so on the earlier question about our, who was asked about the person sitting right behind me talking about how divestment would create this moral issue that would cause people to see the oil industry as sort of a dirty industry. But I think before we get there, there's something you have to prove that if, let's assume BC, and this was sort of addressed in cross-examination, but let's assume tomorrow BC divested completely from its oil, assuming that we didn't have to go through these hedge fund channels, we could do it cleanly. What's the evidence you have that other universities would follow suit? Because even if we grant that if enough people got behind it, it would create this stigma that would stop the oil industry's power and would allow us to invest in this and save global warming and everything would be fine. Do you have the evidence that says that any other institution is going to respond to a change by one university?
So you're asking me for evidence or to predict the future? Because there are universities that have already divested and they've actually had improvements in their endowment returns.
Can you name some major universities?
Unity College.
Unity College?
Yep.
Where's that? I mean, like,
okay, so
how big is their endowment? Like, can you name a major university in the United States or in Europe that's done this?
To answer the question, there are no major universities that have yet divested from fossil fuels. Okay. In the past, history has shown, I think I already quoted it, but the divestment by prominent American universities, in the case of tobacco, for example, Harvard divested.
Does Harvard have any intention of doing that with oil?
Not as we know of now, but there's a big push for that right now. But I mean, the point is that there's a precedent for this. History shows that prominent American universities divesting is a tipping point. It encourages others to divest. I mean, to put it in an even larger scale, there are a lot of people already expressing concerns about the carbon bubble. Recently, a group of 70 investors holding over $3 trillion addressed letters to fossil fuel companies asking them what their plan is and with concerns about the carbon bubble and the future of their investments. I mean, basically, history shows that American universities divesting will lead to others. Other people are already starting to divest. BC has the chance to be a leader and to be the first to do it and to really make a statement. And not only that, but we won't hurt our endowment.
And more than universities have divested. There have actually been 22 cities, including San Francisco. That is a huge amount of money. They have completely divested.
They've completely divested?
San Francisco no longer
they've committed to.
any...
They've committed to.
There's a difference, because like in the case of Seattle, which is also a city that's outlined in BC fossil fuel doc, it also says that Seattle's divested, when the reality of it was that in December 2012, the mayor sent a letter, him personally sent a letter to his fund manager saying, I think you should no longer invest in fossil fuels. And still today, 2 of the top 10 holdings in their portfolio are Exxon and Chevron. So I mean, I think it's an unfair picture to paint that all these places have divested. So far, like we have Unity College is what I've heard.
Well, 10 universities.
Let's entertain one last question and then we'll move on. We're already taking a lot of time.
So I have 3 points to the my question real quick. So I can clarify it a little more. So well, I guess my big question is, what's the actual mechanism in affecting climate change and combating climate change? Because studies by the OECD, the EIA, and even BP state that demand is going to increase, and so the bubble is going to keep, quote-unquote bubble is going to keep growing bigger because of supply and demand. And efficiency, not renewable energy, which is a great cause, but efficiency is the #1 way to cut down on greenhouse gases. So what is the actual mechanism if you take money out of these companies who are investing or who are doing R&D in efficiency? What's the actual mechanism in combating climate change directly?
The mechanism would be, I mean, we talked about earlier the stigmatization process. Every divestment campaign has resulted in legislation. The ultimate goal would be putting a price on carbon that more realistically reflects its actual price. I mean, there have been studies done from the NRDC and other places that have, I mentioned it at the beginning of the debate, but they've estimated that social costs of carbon emissions per ton are something between $21 and $226 per metric ton. And to break even and kind of have no longer, basically, climate change and carbon emissions hurt the global economy. There are studies that show that putting a price on it will make it more expensive, make alternative energy better investments, and bring down the price so we can transition and get all of our energy needs from those sources rather than.
And if you're looking for exact, specific examples, I'm going to give you Massachusetts again. 350, which 350 Mass, half of them it focuses on divestment, half of them is a climate legacy campaign. So these two sects are working together, and they're pushing Deval Patrick in his last few months of office to sign all this climate legislation before he leaves. There have been so many demonstrations and so many people like in agreement with this, so many activists pushing, that he is scared right now that all these students are going to revolt. I'm just saying, this is what happens with the movement. These are, you asked what the effects are, these are the effects.
But how is that related to the divestment of DC?
It's part of a larger social movement. It makes a statement.
What does that matter when developing countries like China are building coal plants like every month, regularly?
China invests so much more money than the USA does in green energy.
Yeah, I would argue China is investing a lot more in alternative energy than the US.
China invests in all types of energy.
You guys have a couple minutes to close the next little bit here, so
okay.
Let's not talk with each other so much.
Yeah.
If you want to finish answering the question, that would be great. That's all.
What was the last part of the question?
So, okay, well, what's the actual mechanism to actually combat climate change? Sure, social change is great, but it's not lowering our carbon emissions. It's not doing anything. It's not taking money away from investment that we can be investing in R&D and research for efficiency, which is the #1 mitigator of climate change.
That's what the legislation.
Just on 328 campuses in the country. Divestment is just one part of a real grassroots international climate justice movement that recognizes the terrifying urgency of this issue that I think has been underplayed here. People around the world are coming together as evidence continually mounts against the fossil fuel industry. And in Massachusetts, as I said, Senator Downing has proposed Senate Bill 1225, which would divest the state's entire pension fund. In about 2 weeks, the Cowboy and Indian Alliance of people who will be on the front lines of KXL, for example, of change, they will be in front of the White House to do exactly what we did. This is growing. More people are going back. We are making a better future right now, but we are up against the fossil fuel enterprise and leaders who are fighting to maintain the status quo. With more financial and scientific arguments and momentum behind us, it boggles my mind that people still question our validity. Words spoken by Gandhi, a mantra applicable here, is that first they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then they fight you, and then you win. They're fighting us right now, and all we have left to do is to win. So please join us. Thank you.
You know, usually when we have debates, right, in the rebuttal, we want to go line by line and look back at some of the arguments that the other team made and address them and see what's wrong. But the problem is that they haven't really spelled out many coherent arguments tonight. What they've done is put forth a narrative confirming that climate change, we're on the brink of serious climate change, that there's going to be big problems 20, 30 years from now. But what they failed to articulate, and I think this has come through pretty well in the Q&A and the cross-examination, is their inability to show how divestment would actually result in fixing those problems. All they've been able to show is that they say, okay, divestment is going to lead to some type of stigmatization. They haven't actually shown how it's going to lead to stigmatization because they have no evidence to suggest that BC, one of many schools in the US, divesting would actually result in any other schools divesting in the first place. I think what's unfortunate is that we have a body of people here, and probably many people in the room with BC Fossil Free, who care a lot about the environment, who find these issues very important, but are unfortunately a part of a group that's advocating a plan that has no real way of enacting change. You know, we've talked about how divestment would have no impact on fossil fuel companies, and they've basically conceded that. Their big argument is the stigmatization argument, but what we've showed is that whether we like it or not, oil and gas and other fossil fuels like natural gas, which those big oil and gas companies like Exxon and Chevron invest in, are the key to getting people out of poverty, building up the world, and so on and so forth. So they talk about there being a growing popularity for that. Sure, someone's going to open the newspaper and see for a day that BC divested. But does that mean that someone's going to change their habits, go drive their car differently, do anything different? No, they still need to get from point A to point B. People in developing countries still need to feed their families, so they still use fossil fuels in exactly the same way with no difference at all. There's no political support for this happening at home. It's the second last of 20 issues of popularity surveyed by the Independent Pew Research Center. And internationally, there's no way that China is going to get into an agreement with the US to curb their fossil fuel emissions. They failed to show any kind of link from the specific divestment movement as to what that would do on campus. The reference to South Africa, the other divestment movements. It's the classic correlation but not causation. They haven't showed that it was divestment that actually led to apartheid falling down, to reductions in tobacco uses domestically in the US. All they've said is that, okay, these are things that have happened, and at the same time, there happened to be divestment going on. And those two things are very different. So I wish we could stand here today and say that divestment is something that can act real change. Unfortunately, it's well-intentioned, but there's no real direction of the movement, and they have no links at all to solving for the problems.
On April 20th, 1970, the first Earth Day, 20 million Americans went out into the streets to demonstrate their support for environmental regulations. The same year, under a very conservative administration, the EPA was created, followed by a flurry of environmental regulations that we still have today. And thanks to that, we live in a much cleaner country and a much cleaner world. Student-led divestment movements during the 1980s brought negative attention to companies operating in South Africa, resulting in a Republican majority passing a sanctions bill over another conservative regime and over a veto of their own president, Ronald Reagan. These students pushed the issue of divestment on their campuses and pushed major universities such as Columbia to divest their holdings. This led to increased concern throughout the financial world. Moral concern, financial concern, and it all became true. There was legislations passed, there was sanctions on South Africa as a result of the divestment movement, as told in the Oxford study that we've been citing all night. Stigmatization of the tobacco industry has resulted in regulations and taxes costing the industry billions. Every divestment movement, from Darfur to tobacco to apartheid, has resulted in regulations and litigation and taxes that have directly affected the industry. Investing in fossil fuel companies is betting against the fact that there will be legislation. It's taking the risk that the carbon bubble does not exist. I would like to see our friends here tell to somebody from the Pacific Islands whose entire country is going underwater that fossil fuel companies are the way to the future and that they will help developing countries. Some countries won't even be here. I've already shown that climate change has a direct impact on the global economy. It affects the GDP, it affects everything, it causes destruction in countries that cannot afford to repair themselves. Investing in fossil fuel companies is betting against the divestment movement, it's betting against history, and it's betting against the human race's ability to protect and maintain itself. BC has to take a stand.
You know, one thing that we share with these developing countries is that we hope that we can empower people's search for freedom and liberty. We hope that we can empower them with an education that will allow them to take action on these issues that are so eloquently put forward here. But let me tell you why some of these divestment campaigns, which are really not effective, they didn't actually directly correlate or even lead to fundamental action. What led to fundamental action were individuals who had the education to actually move, to do something about these types of issues, from Darfur to tobacco use to things like that. It wasn't divestment, it was an education. You know the real stigmatization that universities are afraid of? It's the stigmatization that would accompany them when they move to an investment plan that leads to less resources, less programs, a lesser education that is put forward by the endowment. There has been no evidence put forward by my friends to say here that the endowment fund is going to be any better than how it is now. There's no evidence to support that financially we're going to have those resources. The crystallization of this debate is whether or not the divestment strategy in and of itself is an effective measure. No other university has done it. Other conservation groups haven't done it. There's a reason for this. There's a reason because it's a bad idea. It's a bad idea more so for universities than any other institution because their primary ethical obligation is to all of us. And they do not want to be held to a standard in which all of us are getting less of the education that we need to take action for that. Because there are other ways that our university can pursue action on climate change. Whether it's by us fighting for more efficiency or green measures, more types of research and development funding in the physics department. But moreover, we need to see here that divestment is chasing after shadows that take us away from our primary ethical obligation. As a Jesuit university, education, but education grounded in love for thy neighbor, all of you around here. And that's why we can't support divestment, because it would stigmatize Boston College's main obligation to provide for a setting in which we can take action on these different types of issues.
All right, guys, just a few more, just like 3 more minutes here. First, I want to thank all of our debaters who did a great job. Also, our moderator, Isaac Akers. And then thank you to UGBC and then BC Fossil Free for helping put this on, and then for all you guys for coming. Quick thing, we want to get the after the debate stats. So raise your hand high. Well, a lot of people left, but so should we do it anyway? Yeah. Okay, we'll do some math. So raise your hands high if you are for divestment still, or. All right. Unsure? 5. And now against. Alrighty. These guys did a great job. Everyone did a great job. So one quick